we could probably get started, Pete, Matt.
I think we're ready.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. This is sort of the first edition of what we're calling like a live PPB walkthrough. For those of you who are not familiar, the PPB stands for the Podscribe Performance Benchmark Report. This is our 4th edition, and this one's been really exciting. We've taken a lot of feedback that we've gotten from previous editions, really rebuilt and sort of improved our methodology for how we're pulling these reports. We've increased the amount and the number of advertisers, campaigns, and just really data that went into this. And so, we know that if you're not the biggest data nerd like Pete and Matt here, when you're going through it, it's a lot of data and it could be sort of hard to fully understand. How does this affect me? What is the story that it's telling? So we wanted to take the opportunity to really walk through that. This one, it's going to be, live, right? It's kind of going to be conversational. So usually we save questions for the end, but if you have any questions now, as Pete mentioned, feel free to drop them in. And then as we're going through it, we'll definitely leave time at the end of each section and at the end of each slide really to answer anybody's questions. So feel free to just drop those questions in the chat. We'll do our best to sort of go through them and make sure we end this at the 60-minute mark. So I'll share my screen. Pete or Matt, is there anything else you guys wanted to add?
Yeah, or one quick thing is so you guys could obviously all read the benchmark report. So our hope with this is you can corner us and grill us here with any questions on what was included or things you don't quite agree with or don't understand or things you think should be added next time. So it's definitely meant to be interactive. So, if you don't think something looks weird or you have questions or, definitely don't hesitate because we're eager to, discuss because it's certainly a work in progress for a lot of these. So.
Awesome. All right, well, without further ado, we'll kick it off. Once again, this is the Q2 2024 Podscribe Performance Benchmark Report, the PPB. Just again, to set the stage, this is not just isolated to Q2 performance. It's really the last 12 months coming into Q2. We've got a number of different sections here. We won't go through the full table of contents. You guys can still see my screen, right? Is it moved to the next one? Oh, here we go. All right, this is how we change it. Yep. So let's, again, chat real quickly about the data that we used for this. You guys can all see the data slide, correct?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool, awesome. All right, so for Q2, last 12 months, again, 12-month framework, we almost doubled the number of campaigns that we used to pull in this data and to analyze these results and as well as the number of advertisers. So as, Podscribe grows, as the podcast industry grows in general, more data is coming in and it allows us to, just get a better understanding, make it a little bit, not more accurate, but more robust in terms of, again, the findings that we're pulling in. Matt, anything else you wanted to add here?
No, I just make sure that everyone understands this is a 12-month rolling time frame. So in Q1, we saw data that goes from beginning of Q2 until end of Q1, and then beginning of Q3 until end of Q2 for the next time frame. So rolling 12 months allows us to create stable benchmarks. So just want to make sure I call that out.
Great.
Other than that, I think we're good to move on.
So
let's talk a little bit about the key findings. So there's 4 sort of main key findings, and we will start to unveil these as we go through the slides here. But the first one here is impression versus episodic buys. I think it's important to define this a little bit and exactly what these are. An impression-based buy is where something is being bought, let's say, based on a run of network or even run of show. So typically you'll be dropping ads across multiple episodes of a single show, or it's perhaps a geo or audience-based buy where you may be buying across a bunch of different podcasts and the different episodes. So just to make sure that is extremely clear, an episodic buy will include a baked-in ad as well as a faked-in ad. And so when we break these things out, it's almost as if it's like traditionally how we think about DAI as impression-based and traditionally how we think about baked-in as episodic. When we take a look at the difference in performance between these two things, I think it's clear, and I think most people would expect that you would see a fairly large disparity between the performance of these two, typically seeing episodic buys driving better performance than impression-based. But it's very interesting as we start to dive into the data and we break things out by frequency. We see that controlling frequency can derive similar performance across these two different buy types. And so we want to dive in on that a little bit more. Second key finding is looking at the difference in performance between host-read ads and producer or network-read ads. I think as we would all expect, we typically see host-read ads performing much better than the network-read or producer-read ads by about 50%. But when we start to look at things like how this is being bought, we can start to see where things like producer-read ads can perform to a similar level than when compared to host-read ads. And so we'll dive in on exactly how we do that. Third one is ad stacking high frequency. So this is something that as a customer of Podscribe, you have the added benefit of understanding sort of, are there any placement or delivery issues that are going on within a given campaign? And we've found that specifically some of these flags, such as ad stacking or high frequency, they do start to identify issues because it derives really, or should I say, it drives performance down as campaigns are being flagged with these types of flags. So we'll dive in on that. And then finally, we have an update on the iOS 17 adoption. For those of us that don't know, we will dive in on exactly what that means. iOS 17 has been a very important topic here within the podcast industry. And now that we have reached close to a 90% adoption rate for iOS 17, it seems that we are nearing the end of the Apple Podcast app's excessive download saga. So we'll drill into those as well. So let's dive in. Pete, I'll pass it to you.
All right, awesome. So,
all right. Let's dive in.
Sorry, awesome. So again, high level, let's go through sort of just industry benchmarks in general, visitor rate, install rate, purchase rate, everything like that. So, Pete or Matt, do you guys want to quickly just explain methodology changes here?
Yeah, we just made some slight tweaks. So for the astute readers, you'll notice the benchmarks went actually down a little bit from last year or from last quarter. And the reason is we made a few updates that we think make it more realistic to new advertisers. So before, we did require advertisers had to have at least 5 million impressions to be included, which is not the highest threshold, but we still wanted to lower that just to 1 million to make it a bit more representative. So that was one thing. And then we did do another step that took out, I think, handles outlier campaigns a bit better, because as you can imagine, some campaigns for various reasons just have really high or really low results. And so we took out a few of the really high outlier campaigns, and I think a better process, which we can get into more perhaps later, which I think makes the numbers more realistic. So overall, I think the numbers are more realistic, and I think it's a good thing, because if I don't think any of us want new advertisers who are coming into the space to get discouraged by seeing like, oh, why aren't my numbers at this benchmark? When that number, you don't want, if you have too high of a number that's like, kind of set by the brands that are dominating podcasting, you don't want. I think it's more realistic and more helpful, especially to the newer brands. So we're excited to make that update.
Awesome. So yeah, visitor rate. Maybe explain what visitor rate means.
So if you have 1,000 impressions, or 100 impressions, I should say, roughly how many visitors are you going to get to go to your website? And visitor is a unique metric. So if Matt here visits the page 10 times in a day, he would still count just as one visitor there. So yeah, so our average visitor rate is 0.33%, and the way we do it, so this is getting like a little bit nuanced. I see a chat from Adam, but it's getting slightly nuanced. But what we don't do to get these numbers is we don't just look at every single campaign ever we have and take the average, because the problem with that is some advertisers who have zillions of campaigns and are dominating the space, they would dominate the averages and bring them up significantly. So what we do is we look at every advertiser who meets the minimum threshold in the space, and we see, well, what is their average campaign performance? And then we take the median across all the advertisers. And the only nuance in there is that before we would take the average of each advertiser's campaign. So like, BetterHelp, we would take for BetterHelp before it'd be the average visitor rate of all theirs. Now we take the median of all the BetterHelp campaigns. So that's how we do it, to try to remove outliers and try to have the biggest advertisers not overly weight what we're seeing. And we do that for all the metrics. I won't bore everyone with that same explanation for each of these, but yeah. So install rate, yeah, 0.12%. Roughly how many installs can a middle of the road, a 50th percentile advertiser expect from their impressions? And yeah, same with purchase rate. I think purchase rate is a little tricky, as has been pointed out before, because we do include purchases, we count them as conversions. So I think, some advertisers, say a Helix mattress for $2,000 or whatever is not, it's there's a bit of a different rate there than somebody who's selling $30 sunglasses. So I think that's where industry benchmarks, which we're excited to break out, come into play later, but this is the overall average purchase rate.
Cool. And this one's awesome, Pete, the attributed visitor purchase rate. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really out of all of the people that were exposed to the ad that went to the website, what percentage of those from going to the website ended up purchasing?
Right. That's right. So of the driven visitors, and Jeff, it's podcast only here. So, and so this is of the driven visitors, what percent of them end up purchasing? So I think if you compare it to just your standard run-of-the-mill conversion rate for any old visitors that go to a website, it's probably decently higher, I would guess. And we believe that is because often when people go to a website from podcasting, they're warmed up. They have more intent, presumably, than your average site visitor. So that's why we think we see this number right there.
Cool. Now we'll move on to the next section, frequency. Frequency is obviously a huge topic in the industry, not just related to iOS 17, but just, really how it affects performance. And so we wanted to dive a little bit deeper in here. We'll talk about what the frequency by visitor rates and purchase rate looks like. We'll talk about a share of impressions that get that 15 plus frequency. And then we're going to break down performance by frequency and by the actual buy type to get some more insights into how frequency is affecting not just overall performance, but what the discrepancy between those campaign types looks like when frequency is high or low. So Matt or Pete, why don't we just talk overall performance by frequency? As frequency increases, how does performance look?
You want to go for this one, Matt?
Sure, I would love to. So as we take a look at these benchmarks and we break them out by frequency, we start to see that frequency is a major influencer in the performance of a given campaign. And so as we start to break these things out, right, you go from a 1 to a 2 frequency for a given campaign. And what you end up seeing here is that the results start dropping, and they drop by almost 50% when you go from 1 to 2, and even further as you go from 2 to 3. You see those diminishing results happen fairly quickly once you hit a 3 frequency. I do think it's important to call out that as we're calculating these frequencies, and when we say a campaign frequency, I think it's important that we define this so everyone sort of understands what we mean when we say frequency, when we say campaign. So traditionally, I think, media buyers and planners, and even those that our friends at the publishers are also very much so used to saying a campaign is sort of at the IO level. The way that we think about this is more so at the line item level of an IO. So a single campaign might be a single run of network line item, could be a single audience buy, could be a single episode or baked in ad or faked in ad. So when we think about frequency and when we talk about campaigns, that's really what we mean. So as we see frequency go up within these campaigns, that's where the diminishing returns really start to surface. So we think that this is a very important sort of underlying theme throughout the entire benchmark report. It is very clear to us that as the share of impressions for a given campaign go into the excessive frequency bucket, so we'll call the excessive frequency bucket, we define that as a 15 plus frequency, you see the degradation of results pretty dramatically. So 0% on the far left side of this graph typically will mean we're talking about an episodic campaign. It'll also mean that none of the impressions are going to, or should I say, no part of this campaign is reaching a 15 plus frequency. As you go all the way to the right, 60% of the impressions are in this 15% frequency bucket. So you can see very clearly if we are delivering impressions to a low level of listeners, that the results are dramatically decreasing. So frequency is a very important factor when we talk about what drives the most efficient and effective performance.
So one just quick thing to add is, so the previous slide, just to recap, the previous slide was the average frequency for the campaign, and this next slide, which Matt was just going over, which is a little confusing, just talks about what percent of impressions went to a really small percent of what percent of impressions went to listeners who got over 15 impressions. So if for anybody who uses our dash and they see the high concentration flag on there, that is these impressions. So whatever percent you see that are in the high concentration bucket, we're showing the relationship to performance here. And so both are just different ways to look at the impact of declining performance with frequency. And I think even though the averages might show this, I think we've definitely seen, I don't think in all cases, in all scenarios, some advertisers, maybe they do need a bit more frequency. I think most understand pretty well the need to focus on reach. But I don't think you can necessarily say universal rule.
Hold on, whoever that is.
Bir şey söyleyecektim.
Hi, Reskills Training. Can you mute yourself, please? Oh, we got you. Thank you a million.
Awesome.
So I think I think frequency is an interesting topic. I think most of us, kind of understand the importance of maximizing reach. And I think just generally, lower does seem to perform stronger from our perspective generally.
Awesome. So now let's go into the specific buy type. Matt had already explained really what the difference between episodic and impression-based are. If anybody has any questions or needs that to be reiterated, please drop that in the comments and we'll go through it again. But we're going to show not only visitor rates and just purchase rates across these two types of buys, but we're going to show how performance for each of these buys is affected when, again, we're looking at frequency from this frequency angle. So first, let's just start out, again, high-level performance by episodic first impression-based. Matt or Pete, I'll sort of pass it over to you.
Yeah, so for this one, I think probably for a lot of advertisers in here, if you ask, if the question is, does baked in or dynamic work better, episodic or impression buying work better? Most of what I hear anecdotally is, episodic, or quote unquote baked in does seem to perform better, 2 to 3x. And we do see that in the data. We've seen it in virtually every report we've run. So I don't think that's necessarily a new thing we've added to this slide. But what is new is we try to dig a little deeper into what might be causing this, to unearth what might be some confounding variables. What is causing this difference? If it's just the ad insertion type, or it's just the ad insertion type. So so that's that slide. So let me pass it to Matt.
Yeah, perfect. So that disparity in performance, although seems very large, as we break these campaigns out and we look at the frequency, if we were able to hold, let's say, impression-based buys to a 1x frequency per campaign, you notice that the delta or the difference in performance is actually quite small. You almost start to achieve levels that we're used to seeing in things like host-read ads and episodic buys. And so again, just kind of continuing to sing the rallying cry around frequency being a very important thing in determining the performance of your campaigns. We see that this insight is very strong, that we can actually achieve very similar performance rates between impression and episodic when holding frequency. Pete, you got more there?
Yeah, or I think it's actually a really encouraging thing for impression buys, because I think they sort of have this perception that they don't work as well, that DAI doesn't work as well as baked in. I think that's pretty pervasive in the industry. And I know I've seen like, Adam's LinkedIn post saying they're getting better. It's getting a little better, but it's still not quite there. But I think from what I can tell, this does seem to be there's more differences than just this, but this does seem to be the primary difference between the two. So I think that is encouraging for impression buys that we do seem to be closing in on what is probably the main factor separating them. So if you can control for it in a way, i.e., frequency capping or other similar means, then in theory, the performance should be a lot closer.
Great, Matt, you want to go through, the visitor rate, breaking out these, or just?
I think Pete, maybe you wanted to talk through this.
Yeah, I can do this one real quick. So this one, I probably actually don't need to spend a ton of time on it. It's kind of confusing, but basically it just shows that impression-based buys, it's going back to that high concentration notion of what percent of impressions go to listeners who have 15 plus impressions. And basically what it shows is that virtually all episodic campaigns have like barely any impressions that go to people with 15 plus. So there is a natural frequency capping that happens when you buy episodically. And that's really the point of this. And I think that's the reason, as we see that episodic buys, I don't know if we have it in here, maybe it's later, but when we look at episodic buys versus impression on average, episodic buys have, I think, a 60% lower average frequency. It's like 1.3 to like 2 or something, something like that. But so I think that's really kind of the main difference. So that's probably good enough for this slide.
Cool. Yeah. Again, just supporting that, really when it comes down to the difference between that performance, impression base and that frequency issue is a huge, maybe one of the main factors in terms of, again, seeing those diminishing returns. Okay, cool. Let's go into read type. Again, we'll talk about just high level performance, visitor rate, purchase rate, but then similar to what we did before, let's go into specifically that read type by the actual campaign type and what that performance looks like. And while we don't have this one broken out by frequency necessarily, again, knowing that the impression-based buys on average have a 60% higher frequency, that trend still sort of continues. So we'll break these down a little bit more and go into specifically that read type and what that performance looks like. So let's dive in.
Pete.
So, host versus producer read. I think as Matt was mentioning before, I think generally it's pretty well understood the host read is going to do better than producer read. We've kind of covered this before. It makes sense. So yeah, if the person you trust is reading the ad, it's going to be better. I think we didn't do it in this one. I wanted to, but I think hopefully the next one we will put in cost metrics in here because no matter probably which way you look at it, host read are better, but they're more expensive. So it's not really the question of if they're better. It's like, are they worth it is more the question. So here, roughly, 1.5 to 2x better, I think is what we see here. But we do, similar to the episodic versus impression, we do try to dig in on, are there confounding variables? And the main one is that host read buys are more often episodic than producer read buys. So, as we saw before with the episodic buys having more of an inherent frequency capping, they do seem to perform better. So, so I think that's cool. And then so when we
go ahead, Matt.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if anybody had any questions. I know there's some chats going in here, but we've already gone through a lot of stuff. So if there is any questions, feel free to chime in. You can keep going though, Pete.
Yeah, or maybe quickly. I see, Adam, your point on. I guess we don't need to jump back in the slides, but the other factor being lag to listen. I think that likely is a factor as well. when we do control for the frequency, as you see, there's still, a 10 to 30% gap, which is not nothing. So there's definitely other factors, and I would bet that probably is one of them as well. So.
All right, purchase rate.
Or actually, sorry. Yeah, I guess we can go to the slide, next slide, as you went to. So yeah, so essentially though, when we do control for the buy type, so what if we compare only, host reads that are impression buys to producer reads that are impression buys, or only host read episodic to producer read episodic? Then when we do that, the difference actually gets a lot closer than you might think. It surprised me a little bit. There's definitely still a gap, and I think it'll be interesting to see if this gap holds in future reports as we get more data. So I think the real takeaway is that producer reads can shine in certain scenarios if you control for the buy type and frequency and other things. So host reads I think are certainly stronger, but I wouldn't necessarily say it appears that producer reads are just totally incomparable.
Cool. All right, placement type. So Matt, maybe do you want to explain sort of how we talk about placement in particular? Obviously, the industry uses pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll. We like to take a different approach just because every show, every publisher has a different way in which they sort of break out ads and ad groups. So these two slides in particular, we're going to go through group number and then number and group. Maybe Matt, you can just give a little overview on what we mean by those.
Yeah, so you're right. Typically, the industry, we think about things like pre, mid, and post. It is very common, however, that we perhaps have multiple pre's, multiple groups of pre's, multiple groups of mid-rolls. And so rather than looking at things like pre versus mid versus post, we prefer to look at things in terms of which group something fell in, and then which ad or where was someone placed or an ad was placed within that given group, because you may have, again, multiple ads within a singular group. So if you want to move on to the next slide, what we see here is, well, I guess we'll say generally speaking, in order to derive the best performance, really ensuring that you are within the first, let's say, 3 groups keeps that performance up. You don't really start to see at least diminishing returns here when you start to hit you start to see diminishing returns. We start to hit the 4th group, specifically for visitor rate. And you see purchase rate maybe lag off a little bit more while you're hitting the 2nd and the 3rd group. Really, the most powerful ads seem to happen, I guess we'll say more traditionally what is thought of as within pre-roll. So to maximize engagement and conversions, being within the first group and certainly the first 3 groups is what drives the best performance based on our observations. Now, within the specific groups, we can also look at where an ad was placed within the lineup of the ads within a given group. So, Amelia, do you want to move on to the next slide real quick?
Or one quick thing, or one
Pete, yes, please.
Thing to note for this group number 1. So we've seen this trend pretty much all our reports that generally earlier in the episode is better, and we think that is largely because the listen rate drops off. Not everybody who starts the episode makes it halfway through. So I would probably guess if we could actually measure listens, maybe people who are listening midway through do have a higher conversion rate actually if we're purely tracking our listens, because they might be more engaged at that point and so on. But I think that is probably the main driver for this. But it is worth thinking about, are there other confounding variables like maybe that makes this look perhaps slightly less drastic, such as, are there usually longer ads in the middle? Are there more pre-rolls that are kind of maybe programmatic or other things like that at the start that could actually make this look less drastic than it is? So let me pass it back to you, Matt.
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah, so now let's talk a little bit about the best placement number within a group. It's probably not much of a surprise. I think, based on what Pete's insight, what we think is the sort of variable that drives the drop in results, meaning people that perhaps drop off when they are listening to an episode. They may not listen to the whole thing. The same could probably be said for ad blocks or ad groups. And so as we take a look at this, placement one means someone could end up in any one of those groups, but they are in the first placement of those groups. And so we perhaps see a very similar variable here, that perhaps people are more likely to listen to ads in the first placement versus the last placement. And we certainly see that the performance changes drastically as we go from the first placement versus the last placement within an ad group specifically. Pete, yes, please.
Right. Yeah, I mean, people who if you're tuning into podcasts and an ad block, and I'll get to the question in a sec. But yeah, so if you're listening to a podcast, there's an ad break. If there's one ad, okay, maybe one or two, maybe you'll listen to it. But once there starts to get like 3, 4, you're like, I don't have time for all these ads. Then you're just, I think, a lot more likely just to start skipping at that point. So it seems like it gradually starts to be increased, probably skip rates, honestly, up to about 3, and then at 4 it just seems like things really fall off the wagon there.
Cool.
Perfect.
And that answered the question in the chat. First is typically in pre.
Yeah, first is pre, but the second group may also be pre or could be mid-roll. So that's why we don't talk about pre, mid, or post. We typically talk about ad groups.
Yeah, and it really does vary by publisher, by show. I mean, even sometimes by episode. So
exactly.
Cool. All right, day of the week, again, just high-level performance here. Matt or Pete, I want to sort of talk about the findings that we've continuously seen quarter over quarter.
Yes, so we've seen that basically every benchmark we put out Tuesday or Wednesday is the highest day on average for performance, both purchase, visitor rate. The one interesting thing I would note here is for some advertisers, this chart looks basically flipped. So we have, say, a gambling brand, what their chart, as an example, looks like, especially during the NFL season, is midweek, early week, there's not a lot happening. Maybe Mondays, but like midweek, maybe not a ton. But then on the weekends, things just really, really pick up. So while this is the average, it doesn't necessarily hold for all advertisers.
Yeah, and in Podscribe, you can actually look at this not only by your advertiser, but also
right.
by the campaign. And there's some really interesting findings. Again, when you break it out by certain types of advertisers, some delivery apps, for instance, they'll see like Thursdays being really high performing days. So on aggregate, Wednesday, midweek, we could probably all assume why that's the case. But
right.
It definitely depends.
Right, and often sort of self-improvement things like AG1 or, a Shopify, things like that kind of take initiative, and you got to have energy. And those seem like often they do better like Monday, Tuesday, when you're fresh, you got your trying to make up after the weekend. So.
All right, quick slide here, ad length. How does performance increase or decrease as ad length goes up, specifically when we're looking at visitor rates? So Matt, Pete, want to walk through this one?
Want to go for it, Matt?
I lost my Zoom window there for a second. Gotta love having multiple tabs open at the same time. Performance by ad length. So I think if we are, let's say, reading all of the posts that happen on, Ad Week or Ad Age, if we listen to, I think, what a lot of agency holding companies are saying about the attention spans of consumers, it's that they're going down. And I think one of the most surprising things, and I think that this has been a fairly consistent thing throughout our past benchmark reports, one of the surprising things about podcasts is that as ad length goes up, we actually see performance go up. And there's some confounding variables in here, right? So there are things like host-read ads specifically will typically have longer ad length. And we see host-read ads certainly performing better typically than, let's say, impression-based buys. Or producer-read ads that are generally pre-recorded and are shorter in length. So we see definitely likely that things like host-read ads that are baked in are probably influencing some of the performance rates that we're seeing here at the far right of the graph. it is still very interesting to note, and I think exciting to note, that podcasts sort of don't succumb to the same lack of attention span that we're used to seeing across other channels. And so, yeah, I don't know, Pete, if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, that's the main thing. I think just generally considering the longer read probably will do better is the main takeaway. What I hope to have in our next deck, though, is comparing this with cost, because maybe most people might agree the longer is better, but is it worth the premium of the 60-second over the 30? So I think I think that's probably the question we need to try to answer in the next one, or we hope to.
That would be the great equalizer, I think.
All right, now let's talk about just high-level show genre and what those benchmarks look like. We had these slides last quarter, so exciting to go through how they changed or did not change this quarter. Again, visitor rate, purchase rate, and even ROI, which again is really return on investment, or what your return on ad spend is for every dollar that you spend on these ads. How many dollars on average are people making? So first, visitor rate. Matt, maybe you want to walk through this one?
Yeah, so within show genres, I think this is actually one of the benefits of the Podscribe dashboard, is that we are able to take a look at our campaign performance, and we can break them out by a bunch of different variables to start to understand sort of what's the underlying reason for why performance is better for one thing versus another. And this is one of those really, really great views. So if we have folks like newer advertisers in the podcast space, one of the recommendations that we make is that they buy things like a run of network buy. Those run of network buys are typically a bit lower effort. You can kind of use the same creative. It can be inserted across a wide swath of different podcasts for a specific network that you're buying with. And so as we start to bring things out by things like show genres, you can start to understand, especially for an early advertiser in the podcast space, what particular show genres work, and can you find more shows that fit under that genre for your next campaign to drive better performance. And so interesting to note here, right, that we see quite a few of these show genres performing better than others. So things like tech and business and health and fitness, where, to be frank, for more often than not, they're also fairly brand safe. We see some really, really high performance rates for show genre. When we go all the way to the far right side, we see things like news, history, and fiction. Perhaps those aren't performing quite as well. There are probably confounding variables that help to define this a little bit. And I think in our next iteration, we want to dive in on that more. But you start to see that this doesn't stay the same from when looking at visitor rates versus purchase rates. So whereas business was sort of second in terms of driving visitor rates, it is probably closer to third in driving purchase rates. You can see maybe more of a disparity on some of those other ones, which is, and I had these up, and now all of a sudden I am floundering to showcase this. But so things like, I'm almost there, guys, I promise. Things like religion and spirituality, right? That's very, very specifically, it seems to us that like those types of shows are definitely driving really high visitation rate, right? And they're kind of fifth in the line of visitor rate. When we look at purchase rates, they're a bit lower. They're probably closer to the middle of the pack. And so these types of insights are really beneficial, especially as advertisers are entering the space, to kind of understand what's going to drive the most engaged visitors to your website. If we move on to the next slide, we can look at the ROI that's generated from these as well. And this, again, although these are benchmarks, these are sort of looking at all of the campaigns, the 50 or so thousand campaigns that we analyzed. I think every brand and every industry is going to be different. So the reasons for why one genre works better than another is likely going to be aligned to things like advertiser industry. So interesting to note that overall, we sort of see these fluctuations in terms of driving visitors, performance, and ROI. Next time, we'll want to break things down, barring we have enough data to look at this by advertiser industry as well. Pete, you have other things to add there? Perfect.
Nope.
Cool. All right, new section, super exciting section, add errors and flags. So first we'll sort of explain what a verification flag is. It's definitely Podscribe specific, and then, really answering the question, how do add errors and these flags that appear in your Podscribe dashboard affect performance. So maybe Pete, just give us a high level of really what are verification flags, and then these common ones that we chose in terms of what, flags and issues had sort of the largest impact on performance.
So verification flags, you can think of them like the things you'd catch if you went in and listened to every ad and you manually inspected it. We have a list of things that we hope that we're automatically catching that you would otherwise say, hey, why is a competitor, why is a competitor running right next to my ad, or why is my ad behind 5 other ads, or why is my ad 40 seconds when I bought a 60-second? So things like that are verification flags that the system auto catches to, hope to catch some of the things so you don't, you can feel a bit more confident without listening to every single read. Were you guys just thinking, Amelia?
No, I was just going to say, so, automatically in your dashboard, every error check will be able to apply. And I think we have 18 plus of them, Pete, and it ranges from everything from the promo code's incorrect, there's not below the fold notes, to, again, high frequency, high concentration sort of stuff. And obviously those are really important when it comes to making sure the ad ran as it was supposed to, make sure there was nothing that was said that was not brand safe or part of a do not say word. We've got a whole list of all 18 plus you can find on our website. But other than make goods in general, the question begs, how do these issues, whether it's shorter, whether it has a low ad read score, stacked, how do they actually impact performance? And the results were pretty drastic, specifically for the bottom couple. So maybe Pete, you could just go through, high level, what this means.
Right. So yeah, we picked out a couple here to look at the performance of them to see, because some people ask well, should I really care about stacked, or, should I really, all these flags are kind of annoying. Do they mean anything actually in terms of performance, or are they just good for free make goods maybe in some cases? So that's what we wanted to answer. And some flags definitely map to performance more than others. Double spot was at the top, which means you buy an ad on a show and then maybe you're probably doing an impression buy, and then we find the exact same ad twice or more in one episode. So you're virtually guaranteeing a listener of that episode is hearing just right off the bat the minimum frequency is 2. So interestingly enough, that ties back into our earlier report on frequency, so maybe that one's not the most surprising. Stacked, that is when the ad is at least in the group, there are 3 or more other ads immediately before it. So as Matt was talking about, the placement number in the group does have a pretty big impact. So not necessarily surprising that one is up there. Low ad read score. So all that really means is that the host probably didn't do a personal endorsement, because we passed the transcripts to ChatGPT, and really at this point we really just ask it, did the host personally endorse the read, and we get a score based on how well the host personally endorsed it. So that one is interesting. I think in that regard that personal endorsements do impact the performance. So yeah, competitor, in short, a competitor was in the same episode. I think that probably dilutes the listener's ability to, both one, to know which product to buy, and 2, perhaps second guesses the authenticity of the host.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. I know that a lot of brands, care about, I don't want my competitors in here. I don't want anybody that is even remotely similar to a competitor. Obviously, that's important. There might be certain brand standards there. But, when you're looking at the percentage of performance decrease across, okay, there's a competitor in there, or it's a double spot. That 60% compared to 8%. Obviously, we're not going to tell brands what to do, but really interesting that, the stacked and the double spot, and even making sure that the ad read has that personal endorsement, telling of a story about how this product solved their problem, is way more impactful when it comes to making sure performance is sort of set up for success than even having it next to a competitor.
So the flags matter.
Flags matter, yeah, making sure. All right, cool. We're almost, go ahead. Cool. All right, we're almost
No,
at the
I
end.
think
Yeah, advertiser industry benchmarks. This is another exciting new section. Matt's going to walk through this one, but we went through sort of aggregated show genres and performance, what that looks like across those. And what we wanted to do was because the averages of just like industry benchmarks in general are not, you know, speaking specifically to what types of brands. Again, if you're selling a $30 pair of sunglasses or you're selling a $2,000, you know, heat and cool mattress, you can expect different visitor rates and different purchase rates. So Matt painstakingly went through and developed a really robust methodology in order to sort of categorize these, because obviously multiple brands can have multiple different categories. So we'll sort of go into performance of, you know, specific advertiser types and what those advertiser industries are.
Yeah, I think very general insights here, or at least observations, is when you compare these numbers to the generalized benchmark, right? We see financial services, retail, gaming, and media and entertainment performing at or above benchmark. When we start to look to the right of that graph, things like telecommunications, CPG, automotive, right? We start to see things perform maybe a little bit lower than benchmark. And, you know, from a gut check perspective, I think one of the things that we like to ask ourselves is like, do these make sense? Well, it certainly seems like we can say things like seeing media and entertainment driving high visitor rate. Well, generally speaking, media and entertainment is sort of an online activity now. Gaming can be a very similar conversation. Retail, certainly most, or a lot of retailers at least, have an e-commerce presence. So an ability for a listener to act on ads for these given industries, you know, it's easier for some versus others. Let's compare it to automotive. Obviously, automotive, you know, when we talk about automotive driving people to go to a website, you know, they may go to the automotive website, the actual manufacturer, right? They may also go to their local dealership. And more often than not, those aren't being pixeled. So from a gut check perspective, a lot of these certainly make sense. One other thing that I'll call out here, the one all the way on the far right, CPG, health and beauty, you know, more often than not, these types of products are being bought in store. So therefore, you know, does it make sense for listeners to go to a website? In a lot of instances, the answer may be no. But as we move on to the next slide and we look at purchase rate broken out by industry, you see CPG, health and beauty going up. And this is a factor of a couple of things. I think the first thing here is when we look at all of the advertisers that fall into this industry, when we're looking at purchase rate and deriving a benchmark, we remove any of the advertisers that sort of don't have a purchase that's on their website. So I think that's one really important thing to call out. But the other important thing to call out here is the fact that we see CPG bump up so high in terms of purchase rate is that podcasting does a very good job at driving super qualified consumers to the website. And so, you know, you can sort of flip around back and forth between these two slides and kind of get a feel for those types of things. But that gives you sort of an understanding that, you know, some industries that have sort of like online conversion environments or app-based conversion environments do a really good job at driving immediate action. And, you know, one of the things that we discuss a lot with our clients is how do we start incorporating things like in-store purchases. And so that's something that we're having active conversations about and finding ways to sort of allow those types of metrics flow into the dashboard as well in the future. No promises on timing, but if you are interested, would love to kind of have those types of conversations with you.
Awesome. And again, Matt, this isn't even necessarily like, oh, does one perform better than the other? It's more so if you are an advertiser or you work with an advertiser in one of these industries, outside of just the overall industry benchmarks, what should I, as an advertiser, be really
what should you expect?
What should you compare it to?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably one of the number one questions that we were getting asked as the PPBs were starting to be released, which is, but how does that pertain to me within my industry? So, you know, this helps to answer that question really quickly and really easily. And to give you an understanding of what performance will look like as you start to enter into the space.
Cool. All right, we're almost there. Last couple slides. This is less of a benchmark and more so, you know, we get questions about this all the time. All of that iOS 17 stuff that happened. What does it mean now? Is it still impacting downloads? All of those sorts of things. So we wanted to dismiss any of those concerns and those questions and really walk through some of this data. So Matt, again, or Pete, I'll pass this over to you. But really, we want to show what that adoption rate of iOS 17 in general looks like and how it sort of increased or decreased over time. And then how did that adoption rate have an effect on podcast downloads? Matt, maybe real quickly, or Pete, just high level, what is iOS 17? Why does it matter? How did we find it? And what did this change impact?
As the king of high frequency, Mr. Pete here, I think should do the overview really quickly, since I think he's made a name for himself on this one. So please, Pete, go.
iOS 17 came out in October or so of last year, and what it amounted to, it affected Apple Podcast September 18th. Thank you, Adam. So it affected the download behavior of Apple Podcast listeners. So at a high level, it made Apple Podcast listeners auto download back catalog episodes less. That's like what it is at a high level. I can share later more of like a nuanced thing of what it did, but that was the high level effect. So Apple Podcast listeners, generally, we just saw their download volume go down. We don't think it affected actually any of the people who were actually listening, but I think it was more just downloading back catalog episodes that were probably never listened to begin with, most likely. So that was a fairly big update. And so a lot of people wonder, has everybody updated to iOS 17? Will we continue to see a dip in downloads? So let me pass it to Matt.
So short answer is likely we're no longer going to see much of a dip in downloads, at least particularly as it relates to Apple Podcasts and the iOS sub 17 saga. So within this data, here's what we're showing. We're looking at the number of Apple devices that are on iOS 17 according to our data. And what we see here is that the adoption rate for iOS 17, you had a very, very fast, steep spike going on in Q4. You sort of see how Apple rolled out the iOS 17 update looking at this line. And you see it starts to stabilize there coming around January and is slowly trickling up over time. And we get to a percentage here of around 86%. In the past, where we've seen iOS adoptions sort of peak is around 90%. So again, this is why we answer the question, are we at the end of the iOS 17 download saga? The answer is likely yes. Now the question is, how did it impact things? Actually, Amelia, if you don't mind, we'll go to the next slide and then we'll go back one. So how did it impact downloads? And I think this is probably the one picture that makes it very clear how much it impacted things. So again, that line, that yellow line that we're seeing is sort of the iOS 17 adoption. That blue-black line there is a sampling of the top 500 podcasts and the impact that the adoption of iOS 17 had on the downloads over time. And you see that there's a very steep rise in iOS 17 adoption there in Q4, and you see the corresponding drop in downloads going on at around the same period of time. You also now see throughout the second half, or should I say the second quarter of this year, that drop in downloads is now stabilizing. And we are associating that specifically with the reaching of peak adoption of iOS 17. And so again, it feels to us like we are nearing the end of that saga. Now, I think one important thing to call out here is, as an industry, the term download can be a bit of a challenging thing for some buyers to sort of wrap their heads around immediately. Very much so buyers, especially in the other channels where they command hundreds of billions of dollars in ad spend on an annual basis, if not more, that impressions are a very common way to buy things. So the more that sort of the download starts to align closer to impressions, the more that buyers, I think, feel more comfortable in starting to dip their toes or perhaps expanding their efforts in the podcast space. And hopefully what this means now is that we have a lot more trust and faith in buyers in what they're buying. And so that's iOS 17. Now, I don't know, Pete, if you have other things to add. I was going to flip back to the other slide really quickly, but if you have anything to add, please.
I think it's never been a better time to be a podcast buyer.
Yeah, exactly. Totally agreed. So let's quantify the effect, right? And so here's sort of the overarching way that we quantify, right? Sort of the manifestation of the problem of excessive downloads. The way that we see it is with our high concentration or the 15 plus frequency bucket. And so if we take a look at all the campaigns that we observed in 2023, 20% of the impressions fell into that 15 plus frequency bucket. And as we look at everything from thus far in 2024, it's been cut in half. So we'll continue to see sort of what the drop in, we'll call high concentration campaigns over time. You'll see this for the next couple of benchmark reports. And the hope here is that that number gets as close to 0 as possible. iOS 17 doesn't fix everything because not every app, should I say, some apps still have some high frequency things going on, but iOS 17 is clearly the major driver of high concentration. So that's iOS 17 and where we stand.
Cool. Any questions there? Go ahead, Pete.
We'll just say, yeah, and with that, as we were shown earlier, since the percent of impressions that go to this high concentration bucket of listeners who have zillions of impressions going to them gets lower, performance improves. So it's definitely a good thing for performance. But yeah, I know. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I guess any questions, or is there anything that anyone thinks we didn't answer here? I mean, adding cost is one thing, but definitely don't hesitate to let us know here, or email or LinkedIn or wherever if there are other questions that we should try to answer next time.
Courtney, not a lot of insight just yet on the next version of iOS, but we'll certainly be monitoring it super closely.
Maybe they'll reverse it.
Boy, I hope not. Boy, I hope not. That's great.
So no real insight. My guess is they probably won't mess again with the mass downloading behavior. So, but I guess we'll see.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting, not to add a little bit of an anecdote, but, podcast or Apple and Google, right? They're obviously making some big bets in terms of podcasts. Apple is a company that really prioritizes UX, UI, and auto downloading all of the episodes so that you could immediately listen to them wherever you are was sort of a user feature to make listenability a little easier. And so the fact that when this was brought to their attention and it was actually quantified, the impact that it had on podcasts and podcast performance, they decided to make an update specifically to better this podcast ad performance. I mean, it really does show signs that that Apple in particular, doesn't take podcast advertising lightly. And I think that just speaks generally to the efficacy and, sort of the future growth of podcasting as a whole.
Right. And Adam, simulcasting, yeah, the number of shows that have a simulcast component, we definitely could add that. That would be quite interesting. How for simulcast, the YouTube view share is going up. Maybe there might be something we could do with performance, looking at, say, promos. It's I guess a little tricky because we don't directly measure YouTube, but that's a good point. Yeah, for simulcast, so we should definitely look into. Or in a minimum, like the growth of it too, because it definitely seems to be growing.
It's on the list.
Awesome. Well, we're just about at time, so thank you everybody for sticking around. I know even this walkthrough was very, very data heavy. Hopefully we answered some questions and we explained, some of the more detailed methodologies and whatnot. If you're not a Podscribe customer and you're interested in at least having a demo or seeing, how you could just get up and start running measuring some of your campaigns, fill out a form in our demo request form. If you do mention the benchmark report, we'll be happy to honor some sort of discount, 10%, maybe even more if Pete, sort of approves. But this is
if Matt approves.
Yeah, if not approves, there you go. But thank you everyone again. Please feel free to continue to email us any questions, any feedback that you had on this webinar. This was the first edition, so thanks for sort of being patient and walking through this with us. But more of these to come, lots more data. And if, as Pete and Matt mentioned, if there's anything else you would like to see, any more breakdowns, things like that, we've definitely got a lot of stuff on our roadmap. So we're going to continue making these as helpful and informative as possible, because, knowing how your performance, what your performance looked like, and then, how that compares to the rest of the industry is absolutely critical. Great. And we'll see you all at Podcast Moment.
Thank you, everybody.
DC.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody. Bye.